All right, so with the cloth now trimmed, we can get onto the glassing, and there's a few things you'll need. A good mixing cup. Now this isn't actually ideal because it's quite a small cup. However, these are crazy times we're in at the moment, and this is the best thing I could find at short notice. Now you're also going to need a squeegee sort of apparatus. So this is just a little bit of plastic. It's firm but not too firm. So think like a credit card, for example. And this you're going to be able to use to spread the resin around, really drive it into the cloth and into the timber. So you'll need something like that. On top of that, make sure you have a ton of rags handy because this does get a little bit messy, and what you're going to have to do is when we're squeegeeing it off, you're going to want to wipe it on something, and a cloth is a lot easier than your clothes. And that is basically it. Now I'm going to mix up some resin and we're going to start laminating. As for how much resin you need, I typically will go 350 grams of resin on all of my short boards. Long boards, I'll typically up that to 450 to 500. Now it's going to be too much resin, but I'd rather waste a little bit of excess resin than have to strip the whole thing back because we didn't have enough. All right, so with the resin now mixed, we're going to pour it in the middle. We're going to start working it up and down the board until everything is nice and saturated. And then we're going to start working on the rails. So it's the center out. Now you're not going to want to pour all of the resin by any means. I've only used about half of it here. Anything that's not used here, we'll use to fill in anywhere that needs it, but also to saturate those rails. So to begin, I use very light pressure just to spread the resin and to get that cloth nice and wet. So you can see I'm using next to no pressure on the squeegee at this stage. I'm just spreading it so it's covering most of this fiberglass cloth. So now that the entire board, as far as the flat surfaces are wet, we're going to come in with firm pressure and start really working that resin into the cloth. We're still going to use a similar pattern where we move up and down the board. But what we're doing is just driving that resin through the cloth onto the wood and then really trying to remove any excess. You'll see as I'm working the rails that the resin starts to drip down. That's perfectly fine. We need to saturate these rails anyway. So this is just giving us a helping hand for our next phase. So while I'm doing this, I'm also just looking nice and close at the cloth and looking for any dry spots. So if there's a dry spot, we just come in, we leave some resin on there, let it soak in a bit, and then squeegee it off. All right, so the deck is nice and saturated. We still have to do the final pass to remove any excess, but before we do that, we're now going to start saturating these rails. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to fold the cloth up back onto itself, being careful not to pull it in any direction. And this is where a cloth comes handy because you're going to get dirty. So we're just going to pour a small amount of the resin all the way along the cloth, and we're just going to work it in with our hands. Here I'm just really wetting out this rail and just kind of massaging it into the cloth so that most of it becomes transparent. So now you can see that is properly saturated. We're just going to fold it back over onto the rail. Once again, being careful not to actually pull the cloth, we're just folding it. And then with our squeegee, we're going to start working that cloth down over the rail. So here I work from the center out, and we just start pressing it down using firm pressure, and we keep cleaning up our squeegee every time. So we're really just trying to remove any excess at this stage. And we just want it to be nice and flat. And as long as it gets pressed up along our masked off tape area, then we're going to be good. Now I should mention that I'm using the slow hardener here, so I've got plenty of working time. If you're using fast hardener, you've got to be a lot quicker than this. So now with the rails pressed down all the way around the board, now we come back and remove any excess. So clean rag, scrape and wipe. And we need to do that on the rails as well. What you want at this stage is to see the weave of the cloth and for it to be really even across the entire surface. So I squeegee the deck and then I'll come around and do the same thing on the rails, wiping with a rag every time. So this is the sort of finish that you're wanting. So as you can see, it almost looks dry because we've squeegeed off any resin that was pooling on the surface, and we've just left that saturated cloth to bind onto our timber substrate. So we're going to let this dry. I've used the slow catalyst here, and that's what I would recommend you use for your first time. So this is going to be an overnight dry. So once those had time to dry, we can flip the board over and remove any excess fiberglass from our lap. Now this is where the packing tape comes into its own, because you can easily peel the cloth up from the tape as the resin just won't stick to it, and that makes it really easy to stick a sharp razor blade into the cloth and just zip it along that masked line. Once you remove the excess cloth, you can start blending in that lap to the deck just using some 120 grit sandpaper. Now you don't have to go too crazy with how you blend it in here because it is going to get hidden by the next layer of cloth, but I just make it so it's nice and uniform along the entire seam. Once you've done that, we can mask for the next lap on the bottom of the board. Now when I'm doing the masking for this one, I will do it in the same fashion, except this time I make it so that the tape lines up with one of the seams between the rail and the deck skins. This way, if a seam is left from removing the excess material, it's going to be over an already existing seam in the board and make it dissolve really easily with our fill coats. Now to laminate the fiberglass onto the top deck, it's essentially a repeat of what we did for the bottom deck. Now it should be known with foam boards, it's common practice to do 2 layers of cloth on the top deck, whereas the bottom only gets 1. In this case, I'm only going to go with the 1 layer of cloth because the fact that a timber board is a lot stronger on the deck than a foam board. So really, you don't need it, but it is a good extra insurance if you're worried about longevity or if you're particularly a heavier rider that has a lot of heel pressure on your boards. So just like with the bottom deck, we've got roughly 300 grams of resin here, and we're going to mix that up, and then we'll start from the middle, working our way out, saturate those rails, and then remove any excess. So we do our central pour. Make sure we keep some in the cup. Then use light pressure to spread the resin. And that's just going to saturate our cloth. Once we've saturated the deck, we start moving the resin out to the rails. So now I'm going over the deck with firmer pressure on the squeegee, and we're just driving that resin into the cloth. So now that the deck is saturated, we're going to lift the rails up onto the deck and saturate these with the extra resin we kept on the side. So as you can see, the rail is fully saturated, so now we just carefully fold the cloth back down, being sure not to pull the fabric in any direction. And then I start working the rails down. So just going to get rid of all of this extra resin by squeegeeing it over the edge. Now we work from the middle out. So we're just going to press the rail down, keeping the cloth nice and tight. And now I'm pressing the overhang onto our taped zip line. So now I'm squeegeeing off any excess, working from the middle out and wiping it on my rag. Now we're hitting the rails. Okay, so this is looking really nice and dry because we've removed all that excess resin and have just left the cloth. So now we just need to let this dry until we can do the cut of the overhang and then move on to doing the filler coats. All right, so this is now fully dried, so we can come in and start lifting our cloth up from the tapes and then sliding our knife along the seam.